Welcome to Real Food, Real Stories with Naomi Starkman of Civil Eats.
My eating growing up was like food was not my focal point. It wasn't until I went to college that I learned that garlic doesn't come out of a salt shaker because I didn't know that. Well, something really interesting happened to me, and that is I had a kind of a break between school, and I totally revamped my garden, my San Francisco oversized lot, and I was obsessed with gardening. And I slept with my Western Sunset garden book in bed. But you know, people were not master gardeners back then. Like, this was not a career. We didn't encourage people to farm or garden. You know, we go to law school, right? Or we go to become doctors. Like, we do the things that have the degree. And so I spent 6 months gardening, put it on hold, and it took me 20 years to come back to it. And that was a long time. And what I ended up doing was realizing that nobody cares about public policy, actually. And the court of public opinion is where issues move further faster. So I decided to work in media to try to figure that piece out. I was in the media capital of New York. My path to food started there because we had a New Yorker festival event, which is this like 3-day arts and literary event. And Alice Waters and Dan Barber and Peter Hoffman had this amazing meal. And I stood there, this is 2003, I stood there and I looked at this food and I was like, wow, what is the story behind this food? Like, I didn't care so much about how it tasted, I wanted to know where it came from. And Alice was the one who told me that you could go anywhere in the world and work on an organic farm, and you could woof. And I left and I went to woof 3 months later in Costa Rica. And when I took a little boat to Nicaragua to go work at this coffee plantation, there was a organic farmer on the boat with me. And she turned around and she looked at me and she said, "What are you doing on this boat?" And I said, "I do not know." And she changed my life. She changed my life. She became my farming mentor. She became a friend and a sister. And she owns one of the oldest and largest organic farms in Washington State. And she said to me, when you get back to New York, you've got to figure out how to farm. She said, you've already done it already. You've already been a lawyer, kind of a media person now. If you want to be a farmer, if you really want to work in agriculture, you need to find a place to farm. So Dan Barber had just opened Stone Barns. And this is their amazing farm that's really incredible out in Tarrytown. It's about, 45 minutes from New York City. And so I became one of their first apprentices. And I lived in New York City. I would put my bike on the train at 125th Street in Harlem, take it out to Tarrytown, and then ride to the farm. And I did that for an entire year, and everybody thought I was crazy. You know, farming was not cool at that time, like, you know, and by the way, I was still working at the New Yorker, so it was like, the people at the New Yorker were like, what are you doing? Like, and I was like, I'm farming, it's amazing, I'm learning from the plants, and they were like, okay, crazy hippie lady from California. And then I just followed that dream, and my farming mentor needed a person to work on our farm in Washington State, and I quit my job at the New Yorker, and I told the editor, David Remnick, I promised you that these issues are gonna matter someday. And they do, right? I left and I went to farm for a year, and it was the most confusing and frightening and scary time of my life. I left a 6-figure job at probably one of the most important thinking magazines in our country to earn $10 to work as a farmer. Planting 75,000 leeks and watching them and tilling them and harvesting them and packaging them in the weekly CSA boxes for 1,500 people taught me more about how food is grown than I could have ever learned in any other way. I have the most respect in the world for farmers, without whom we would not eat. I mean, these are the people who, to me, are my personal heroes, like all the farmers I worked with. And I somehow had this notion that there were these stories that could be told about food, and that somehow there was like a gulf missing between all these things that you guys care about, right? And then like the rest of the world. Like, how do we actually tell those stories? How do we make those stories matter? So I came back to San Francisco in 2008, and I worked on Slow Food Nation, which at the time was a very pivotal event in San Francisco here. We started a blog as part of Slow Food Nation, and the blog was our way to invite people to this conversation. And by the time we had the event, there was close to 1 million visitors on our website. And after the event ended, we decided to make that blog Civil Eats. So Civil Eats has been around since 2009. It was started by me and our co-founder, Paula Crossfield, who worked with me on Slow Food Nation. And Paula and I worked on the site for almost 4.5 years, and neither of us, I still not paid, but neither of us were ever paid. None of our writers were paid, none of our editors were paid. Everybody who did anything for Civil AIDS, it's always been a labor of love, which is pretty freaking amazing. We won the James Beard Foundation's Publication of the Year Award, as Payre said, in 2014. And I have spent the last year in this incredibly stressful place of trying to not only fix food, but also try to figure out how do we fix journalism, right? Because they're two sides of the same equation. We expect cheap food and we expect cheap journalism. And their values proposition. Like, we're not gonna write around a story, we're not gonna chase the news, we're gonna do something that, you're coming to our site because you want to be nourished, right? Like, you want food for thought, and you want actually something that you're not gonna read somewhere else. Or you might not have heard, or maybe you didn't have that point of view, or you didn't know that person was writing that or thinking that. I often will have a story that we'll read and I'll be like, oh my God, I'll have tears. I just will be so moved by it, and I know our readers are too. And I think that's how we're changing things, it's through the narrative of telling stories.
I just hope you leave tonight feeling more connected to the food system, and also feeling more connected to the people around you.